Yeah, so this is the last talk of the day, so hang in there. The reason both Luke and I are talking about this is because we actually had this experience together looking after some issue that I'm going to show you now on GerritHub. We thought it was useful to share it with you guys and take it as an opportunity to discuss about the way we analyze this problem and what you all can do if you encounter similar things. So the title is How Healthcheck and Multi-site Keeps You Sleep at Night. Is because this is actually the story not of an outage, but how we actually avoided an outage. So
yeah, I know that some of you guys have pager duty sometimes active and you wake up at night. It's not nice. So this talk gives you some very, very simple tips how to have better nights without being woken up because Gerrit is not working. No.
So yeah, as some of you might know, we are running GerritHub, which is a publicly available Gerrit service that you can all go and. So GerritHub is a fairly big installation. We are hosting more than 50,000 repositories. We have like 30,000 active users, and we host more than 600,000 changes. We're not running this all in one single Gerrit instance, but we are actually we have different hosts. They are geolocated across the globe, and we actually use a multi-site to actually keep all those hosts in sync. There were many talks about multi-site and how to install it, all the features about it. So if you don't know what multi-site is, or if you're looking for help on how to run it, you can go and get in touch with us or look at those talks. But yeah, so we got one alert one day. We actually have an integration with our Slack channel that one of our hosts was actually down, and it was actually classified as unhealthy. So Luke and I went to look after this problem, and we actually started immediately. The first thing you do when you get something like this, you head to your metrics, your dashboard. So we had to Grafana. Actually, we have the Grafana dashboards that we populate through Prometheus. We are running the Prometheus exporter plugin, and we have our dashboards, as most of you probably do. And we immediately found that we had some health check failures. As you can see from the graph on the top right corner. So zooming in a little bit more, we actually specifically found that these failures were related to authentication. So we actually had some problems. So that specific node in our multi-site installation has some problems authenticating users. Looking at the logs, we actually confirmed this because we found some occurrences of this error specifically. Multiple entries with the same key. As you know, Gerrit keeps user information in the all users repositories, and we are using a plugin, which is a GitHub plugin, which is an integration plugin that allows the user to authenticate in GitHub, and then we acquire an OAuth token. And we actually store that in the all user repositories, and the reloading of these the all users with the new information coming from the user that just logged in created somehow an outage. So Luca and I started investigating this problem, and we actually found that this is an issue that it's been introduced actually in Gerrit 3.6. We created an issue for it, which is linked to this slide, and we still haven't got to the bottom of it, so the issue is still open and out there for grabbing. We know it's to do with the exactly, with the concurrent reloading of the external IDs, which tries to.
That's one.
Yeah, exactly.
So this has been raised 3 days ago, but if you're on 3.6 and you don't have HA and you don't have health check, after the stock, install it straight away because you have this issue in your server. And if you don't have health check, you don't realize you have the problem, and the consequences could be disastrous for Gerrit. And the second point, if you have the health check plugin, but you are not in high availability, if you get this problem, you need to really to wake up at night and clear the external ID cache immediately. Otherwise, whatever you do is failing. But Tony is going to explain why without the health check plugin, you wouldn't see that it's failing, even if it's failing.
Yeah, exactly. As we said, this is the story of how we avoided this outage. So we observed this error. We actually took the time to investigate it and triaging it. But we actually didn't have any problems because, as you can see from this other graph that I'm showing you right now, actually one of our nodes actually immediately took over. The issue arose around 1520, as you can see, and actually you can start seeing the JGit cache of the of another node that we have available in the multi-site deployment. That starts picking up the traffic. So from a user experience perspective, there was no outage. So the Gerrit Hub continued serving traffic as usual, and we were actually happily up and running. How do you evaluate the health of your Gerrit instance, right?
Yeah, I will do a poll on this one. So first of all, do you have an alert if Gerrit is unhealthy in your system? Your setup? Okay. So what do you check? How many of you are checking if the Gerrit process is up and running? One? Okay. So this is good. Let's go to the next step. How many of you are checking that Gerrit is reachable from an SSH and HTTP? Because in our case, it was up and running. It was reachable, SSH, HTTP. Next step. How many of you is checking if the Gerrit UI was rendering responsive? In our case, it was rendering, it was absolutely responsive. Move forward. So, in our case, Gerrit was up, it was reachable, the UI was super fast, responding, rendering everything. Was it healthy? If you cannot load the external IDs, whatever you do anonymously is fine. But as soon as someone tries to do something, I do a review or do whatever, boom, 500. Yeah. So, that's a very important concept because if you do HA, if you implement HA in a kind of generic way, and many companies, they treat Gerrit just a service like any other. Yeah, I know how to do HA. I do for, I don't know, Jira, Confluence and everything. Go there, share a file system, load balancer, healthiness, give me a URL to the GUI. GUI is there, done. And in this case, we have caused that global issue because it was an issue in the code. So if you keep that spreading, so it's going to take down the first node, then the second node, then the third node, then the fourth node, everything goes down because the issue is in the code, right? Understanding how you define healthiness in Gerrit is key to have a good night's sleep and not waking up because things start to fall apart. Because if you tackle the problem in Gerrit before it becomes a problem for the users, you have the experience that Paul was talking about by saying, I never see any problems with Gerrit Hub. Everything works smoothly. Yes, because we solve the problems as much as possible automatically, and when it's not possible, manually, before they become a problem for the user. So the user is never impacted.
Exactly. So in order to address all these issues, like there is no, and not to have like a naive way of checking whether Gerrit is healthy, few years ago, actually, we created the health check plugin, which we obviously used in our Gerrit Hub deployment and is also widely used out there. And
how many of you are using the health check plugin in prod? Only 2, not that many. 3, but it's not this one. A fork of this, but the same concept, yeah? Sounds good. For the ones that are not using health check plugin, let's have a look if we can convince you to use it.
Yeah, you really should, because so what you get is you get a new HTTP endpoint that you can query, and is in this form. So you just hit the Healthcheck status endpoint, and you get a payload, which is a JSON payload, which has this shape. Actually, the payload is much longer than that. I couldn't fit it in one slide, but as you can see, is actually composed by different components. Each one is dedicated to testing and checking one particular aspect of your Gerrit installation. So we're going to have an overview of some of these components and what they mean and how you can configure them, and hopefully you will find some values. So yeah, as I said, these are component-based. You can enable or disable each component, so there might be something that is not relevant for you or you're not interested in checking, so you can just disable that. And you can configure it depending on your needs. We're gonna explain a little bit better. Also, you get metrics out of the box. So for each component, you will get a matrix that gets emitted that will signal success or failure for that component, and also the latency of every single type of check. And if you do have some sort of monitoring system, you can easily integrate these metrics in your monitoring system, which is the reason why we could observe that behavior in the Grafana dashboard, as you've seen before.
In this case, nothing was working in Gerrit because you couldn't load the external IDs. But imagine a different situation. Imagine that your Gerrit is serving one repo that is the most important monorepo of your company, and if that repo doesn't work, basically you've got 99% of the company shouting at you, and maybe another 20,000 repo. So when you define the check, this plugin is configurable. You can say what for you is really something that you should wake up at 9. So for instance, you may say, I don't really care about the general status of Gerrit, but I care about that this particular repo should be super duper healthy. Because imagine that in this case it was a software bug, but imagine that there is a disk failure, right? And one of your multi-site server is start corrupting the data. So you want to shut down that server as soon as possible, because otherwise the corruption starts spreading and you got a much bigger problem. You don't have just the problem that Gerrit is not working, but all your sites that are polluted, right? So in that case, you could also configure the plugin to say, listen, for me, if the query on this repo doesn't work, take that node down and don't serve traffic to it anymore, and then wake up people at night because they need to look immediately what's going on, okay, before it becomes a much bigger problem.
So as we said, you have different components. The query changes is one of those components which checks the ability to query changes. So it's actually a way for you to check that your index is actually not corrupted and it works fine. You can define a specific query that you want to run. As Luca was saying, you might decide that a specific repository or specific query is mission critical for you, and you can also define a timeout. Something, you can say that you want that query to be served in a within 20 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds, whatever you decide that number to be. And so not just corrupted indexes, but also slowness on the entire system can be considered when evaluating the entire healthiness of your Gerrit instance. Index is one of the aspects. JGit, obviously, very, very important, and is a component that you get as part of the Healthcheck plugin that you can actually enable by default, and it checks the connectivity to the file system and the ability to open a JGit reference object. So specifically, it will open the REST metaconfig for the repository, so it will check that the repository is not corrupted. You actually fetch that reference. Out of the box, it will check all users and all projects, because we know that Gerrit just doesn't function without those. But you also have the ability to add additional repositories. As Luca mentioned before, there are...
If there was a corruption.
If there was a corruption, you also wouldn't want to consider your Gerrit as healthy. Auth is specifically the issue that we found now. As you've seen in the dashboard before, we were specific metrics emitted because of the failure of this particular component. And these basically tell you if the Gerrit side of the authentication works. This doesn't mean that, for example, if you're integrated with LDAP, it doesn't mean that necessarily the LDAP might be down. You've seen how the auth component failed in Gerrit, even though we didn't have any problems with GitHub specifically. But that just means that Gerrit is not able to make usage of that authentication backend. So you're evaluating the all user health and basically function as an account manager functionality. So you will actually specify a user and password, and then you will test that, you will simulate users logging in your system.
So one remark on this one. So the Healthcheck plugin will not do a real authentication with your authentication backend. Because imagine the case of GitHub.io, right? So we do authenticate with GitHub. What if GitHub is down? If GitHub is down, all the sites of GitHub.io will go down as well. But do you really need to go down? Because we authenticate with GitHub, say, once a day. And if GitHub is down for less than 1 day, you can still work on Gerrit. And as soon as GitHub comes back, then Gerrit will replicate to it. So what this plugin is checking is all the machinery on Gerrit should work, except the authentication with the backend, because we are health checking Gerrit. We are not health checking GitHub. Then, of course, it's something you want to do as well, but you need to focus on what is your target. Your target to see, is Gerrit healthy? And the answer is yes. In this case, the answer was absolutely not, because you cannot, if you cannot look up users, you cannot look up account, you can't do anything, right? In this case, the external ID lookup was broken because there is a very serious bug in 3.6.
Yeah, there are many other checks that you get as part of the Healthcheck plugin. You can...
Project list. Let me tell you why I added a project list. Do you know what is the first thing that the Gerrit Trigger plugin does against Gerrit? Project list. And if the project list is slow, what happens is that you start Gerrit, the Gerrit Trigger plugin says project list, the project list is pending, the Gerrit Trigger plugin doesn't see an answer, it runs another one, and another one, and another one. So what was happening is that as soon as you were starting Gerrit, it was killed by the Gerrit Trigger plugin. So we needed to add this one, so in a way that when Gerrit was coming up, until the project list was quick enough for the Gerrit Trigger plugin to be queried, was outside the balancing list. So when it was quick, they would say, okay, now Jenkins, you can shoot at Gerrit. But before it would say, it's helpless, it's too slow. If you're going to send project list is one of the heaviest operations you can do in Gerrit, because will trigger the load of the cache that is loading all the projects. We have over 40,000 projects in Gerrit, in GerritHub.io. It takes 15, 20 minutes to come up. And we don't want Jenkins to call us in those 20 minutes. Call the other nodes, they are ready to serve your request, not this one.
We also have other components, active workers, for example. You can check the number of active worker threads. So that means that if you're running a Gerrit instance that has exhausted the number of active workers, that Gerrit instance effectively is not usable anymore, because it cannot get any more work to be done.
Yeah, one thing about this check, you can also configure a threshold that is less than 100%. And that gives you also another benefit. Imagine that you have an HA system that you use in active-active, and we go maybe not just 2, might go 3, 4, 5 nodes. In that case, it means if the load balancer is not evenly distributing your load, maybe the balancer is putting too much stress on one node. And in that case, you will see that Gerrit starts running out of active workers. So the Healthcheck plugin kicks in. They say, man, you reach already 80% of active workers. So it's basically giving a kind of pushback to the load balancer, say, consider me unhealthy because I'm getting really close to my maximum threshold that I can do. It's like back pressure, right? It's back pressure into the load balancer that is giving more load to the other nodes. In the meantime, that node finishes its worker, goes down, and then gets the traffic back. So we did a lot of extensive testing for configuring the plugin in this way. We were really, let's say, getting Gatling on multiple clusters and hammering Gerrit. And we were seeing, so what happens if, I don't know, we give to Gerrit 3 times the maximum workload it can manage? Can we still manage to stay alive? And we reached a point where they were kind of dying and coming back, but the system was resilient. They were auto-recovering. And this is what we wanted to achieve with this plugin, a self-healing system that allows you to not be called at night. That's the focus. Sleep at night. Yeah.
Yeah, same
With
can be
deadlock.
said for deadlocks. We actually had experiences with this where we experienced deadlocks. Deadlocks are reported by the JVM, so you can actually query the JVM, and you can ask for deadlock situations, in which case you can actually make your health check plugin fail on that, so that you can actually switch the traffic to healthy nodes as well. And again, same concept that you can also check the number of blocked threads. That you can actually check set thresholds, as Luca explained, for the active threads there, where you can define, for example, that if, say, for example, 80% of your available threads are blocked, then something might be going on, and you want to.
Yeah. So blocked threads is different from active workers. Blocked threads means that basically your clients are holding the connections to Gerrit. Because sometimes Gerrit is dying, not because Gerrit is in trouble, but the clients are too slow. Though instead of, imagine you start a clone, then of course you need to keep that thread alive until the client gets all the data. And if the client doesn't consume the data, the thread is getting blocked in Gerrit, but it still use some of the slots. And then if you keep on using that node, people will see that the GUI doesn't work anymore, but actually Gerrit has been killed by the Git client, because the Git client are slow. And when people started working remotely during COVID, we saw a lot of these problems, because people started using VPNs, and they would say, why, when people is working from home, Gerrit dies? And actually, Gerrit is not dying. Gerrit is really, really happy, doesn't have any problems, but just there are a lot of blocked threads. That's why we introduce these checks by saying, if you see that this node is okay, is healthy, but there are too many blocked threads, give the traffic to some other nodes so that node can recover.
Yeah, this is actually a pattern that many companies have seen, where now suddenly Git data had to be transferred to people's houses. So all those connections, so the SSH threads, they had to be kept for longer, which meant that all the settings you had for your Gerrit needed to be retuned. This is the result of the single components. You also get an overall status. So first of all, you get an HTTP status, which could be, say, for example, everything is successful. You get that to 100 OK, so that means the health check is successful, and that instructs the load balancer to actually consider that node as healthy. So the overall status is the cumulative result of the individual checks. If one of the checks fails, then the overall status of the health check is also considered to be failed. You also get a useful metric, which is the overall latency of the execution of the entire health check, and this is the maximum of all the latencies. So these components are actually executed in parallel, but the code is written in such a way that it will fail fast. So as soon as one of these components will fail, it will immediately return with the correct HTTP status. So it will instruct immediately the load balancer that the instance should not be considered healthy. So you can actually plot all these metrics nicely in Grafana. As you can see here, we have the latencies. They're actually plotted in the graphs above, and now you can see, for example, that you can have a dedicated graph for each one of these components individually. So you can have the query changes, the project list, the JGit one, etc., etc. So that will help you pinpointing exactly what the problem is before you even had to Gerrit and start opening the logs.
So the auth failure. So this was changed from the external system or from Gerrit?
So the issue, so it's been discussed with Patrick, was on a code change that Google did for the loading of that cache. So that cache is loading one ref in all users that is called RAS meta external-ids. So that ref contains all the IDs of all the users of all the accounts you got in the system. So for us is a lot, something like 100,000 files or something, right? So it was huge. And also in Google is big. So that we're saying the loading of that cache was taking something like 30, 40 seconds. So Gerrit from 3.6 onwards is able to load that information in a differential way. And apparently the algorithm is broken. Because they say it should have not happened. Because the way that it works is try to understand what was the previous status and what's the delta, and then it's trying to understand what needs to be added to the cache based on the delta. But in that case, it took the same key twice, and then basically polluted the cache in memory, and then boom, game over. Gerrit was unable to do anything. So Patrick Heisel from Google, that is the guy that wrote the algorithm, so it's already on the change, so he's asking for some information. But the point is, if you are on 3.6, be careful. So install, first of all, the health check plugin straight away, and put an alert if the health check is failing. Even if you see that Gerrit is working, or you need to, in this case, so the remediation, mitigation is flash the external ID cache straight away. If you flash the cache, the differential loader sees that there is nothing, and they do the full loading. As soon as we flash the cache, was all back.
So with the auth check again, sorry, to stay on theme. So you say that, okay, maybe I'm using LDAP, maybe I'm using GitHub to log in, but you guys don't kind of care. Yeah. And you're able to test that anyway. How? Like, how can you separate completely from the
So first
the
of all,
backend?
GitHub is already a lot of health check that gives you out of the box. So if you want to check what's the healthiness on GitHub, they have a channel. And then you go there and tell you, see if it's healthy or not. And I can tell you that it's a lot less healthy than Gerrit. If you were to fail Gerrit whenever GitHub is failing the authentication API, the uptime of GerritHub.io would have been 95% or less. Yeah. Whilst at the moment, the availability of GerritHub.io is over 4.9. We are pointed to 5.9, that is 99.999%. At the moment, we are 99.995 or something. And those stats are taken from Pingdom. That is pinging our services every minute.
Yeah, but how can you do? Like, how does the health check for auth keep that out?
Yeah, because that specific check, the health check is a kind of pluggable, right? So the health check says, I allow checkers to do their job and tell me what's the result. If we had the inter-plugin dependency, it could also integrate checks coming from other plugins. Imagine multi-site. So health check could say, multi-site, if you're telling me that this node is behind in replication, I will consider an healthy. At the moment, we cannot do that in Gerrit because we don't have inter-plugin dependency. But with regards to the authentication, so that checker is done in a way that is mocking the authentication and is triggering all the machinery that Gerrit does. And that's why you notice that if the account is not there, the health check is failing. Of course, you need to configure what's the user that you want to use. It's not going to check all the users, but...
Yeah, so I guess GitHub LDAP will have a common interface and you just stub that out.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
You have to consider that also, if you were, imagine the health check is running every, you might configure your HA proxy or whatever load balancer you're using to run health checks every, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, right?
GitHub would throttle you straight away.
Exactly. So if you were actually to go to your auth backend, that often you might actually contribute in creating an outage because of it. So yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, my name is Paul. I work on the Q project. We're a small user of Gerrit Hub, but a strong supporter. So thank you to Luca and everyone who maintains that. Just to back up anecdotally the fact that we see many, many more outages on GitHub than we've ever seen with Gerrit Hub. I can't actually think we've ever seen an outage on Gerrit Hub, and we use it enough to surface these things. So thanks for that. Luca, you mentioned one thing where every day you have to re-authenticate with GitHub. Can we configure that in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, actually, that's the point. So that's a long story, actually, because it's not related to the GitHub plugin or GitHub, but it's related to Gerrit. So Gerrit does not allow to basically renew an existing account token. So when you look at with Gerrit gives you a cookie that is called Gerrit account. The cookie has an expiration, and Gerrit does not allow to use a cookie to create another cookie. And the way that GitHub manages is that allows you to do that. So it means as long as you come back to GitHub every day, say, oh, you came with this cookie, then it's fine. Automatically will give you another one. So every day, if you are not staying away for long, it will be considered logged in. So I believe it can be done, but in Gerrit. We can't do it on GerritHub.io. We can't do it on GitHub plugin. It needs to be done in Gerrit. It is feasible, But we need to change that in Gerrit, and we need to understand if the user, they are using Gerrit, they will say, is that secure enough? Maybe not. So that's the point. We can configure to once a week. Yes, we can do once a week.
Perfect.
Okay, that we can do. That we can do. Once a week is fine.
In spring this year, we had a sporadic issue with the Gerrit web interface. That the problem was that sporadically the SSL connections between the web interface and the server were failing. And it was a soft issue, so only in rare cases it was visible to the user interface. And would the Healthcheck plugin be helpful in identifying such sporadic issues, or would you rely on the monitoring system that you connect to the Healthcheck plugin?
Yeah, so the good thing about the Healthcheck plugin, it is giving you that information not as a Boolean, works or doesn't work, but as a metric. So in that case, for instance, if you have, you were talking about the SSH threads, they are getting stuck and then utilization goes up. So because we are checking the workers and the SSH threads are workers, so it's not just that it's giving you the ability to declare the instance an LT, but you can also see what is the current utilization. You could say, for instance, if I see, and that's a rule that you can put on Prometheus, for instance, you can say, if that specific metric exposed by the health check goes over, I don't know, a certain threshold too many times a day, then raise an alert. Okay, so you can definitely do that. So typically what we do is to define, let's say, a Boolean that goes into the alert channel if goes over the threshold that we define, so is defined as an LT. But also, we keep an eye on the metrics. So when we see that, for instance, a node is considered healthy, but for instance, the health check for Gerrit starts going over, let's say, 10, 20 milliseconds, we say, there's something that doesn't look right. Because for instance, if it takes more than, imagine you go your local SSD, and Gerrit is taking more than 20 milliseconds to read a ref or an object, it means you've got some problems, either on Gerrit or in the file system. Of course, you need to tune in with the file system you've got, because you can't, let's say, expect NFS to react in 20 milliseconds, unless you use fiber channel. So I believe Qualcomm, they use NFS with fiber channel, they go microseconds late.
The plugin is written in a way that is really easy to extend if you wanted to. So
message for Jose, if you want to put extra checks, can be done. And if you want to make them open source, we are going to be happy as well. No, actually, there was one point made by David Ostrowski, because I posted an experimental inter-plugin dependency, and actually I did it as a lib module, right, that enables that. So basically, if it's going to be approved, but could be approved as a lib module, basically it means that you could extend the health check with your custom checks, even in Groovy, because some companies have the constraints. Really, we would like to contribute to open source, but the legal process is so long that we can't. So what's the point? So forking is never a good idea, but if the plugin allows him to write 2 lines of Groovy script and add a custom check, and then the 2 lines of Groovy script is going to be internal Nokia, but the plugin is open source. So he avoids having troubles when he needs to upgrade.
And to add to that, with your prototype change, you wouldn't even need to stop Gerrit.
Yeah.
You would add a new health check component implementation
without stopping Gerrit.
Without stopping Gerrit.
Yeah.
All those components, it's worrying that the request say I activate all of them, and I have 50,000 repository, and I do care that all of them are healthy, then the request itself would take ages.
But the Healthcheck plugin is only reporting that information, right? So when to fail or be successful is up to the logic that you add to your. It's like what Luca was saying. Like we're just exposing that information, and then if you have an alarm in in Grafana or on Prometheus, or if you set your HA proxy to actually fail only if the health check consistently fails for 10 minutes, or you might set a timeout. So if you have some queries that are crazy and would take longer for them to execute, yeah, of course that is that's not a healthy health check. But then you will Exactly,
Yeah,
but then
you
you
need to be
will.
careful. Don't create additional log, otherwise it's like, I don't know, the doctor that is using the hammer to see if you're alive and just banging your head, yeah? If you were alive, you're not alive anymore.